From right off the bat, I'll be very honest with you. I know very little about mountain pine beetles. In fact, the closest I've come to them are these twins here. So I guess they're going to watch over my talk. But when Keith asked me to give this talk, it was like, okay, how am I going to be able to provide information to you that is useful for what you have to do? And when I was thinking about it, what you have to do and what you have to address with these mountain pine stands is really no different than any other system I've worked in over the last 35 years. And some of those systems I've worked in everything from dealing with trees that are 20 meters tall to dealing with tissue culture plantlets which are 2 centimeters tall. And what I mean by that is the system that you guys have to work on is the exact same. In other words, you have a plant-based system that has an issue, you need to solve the problem. You're applying a series of cultural practices to try to solve that problem, to try to successfully reach some kind of endpoint. When you apply those silvicultural practices to that plant-based system, those plants react to that based on the cultural activities you do and the surrounding environment that you put them in. On top of that, you have an operational issue that's going on. And I've worked around operational programs for almost my whole life. And one of the things I've realized is when we get into an operational program, one of the things that happens is we have a series of management goals and objectives we all have to obtain to get to that end point. And time and again, I've seen in a lot of those situations, we've turned that plant into a widget to achieve our goals as a human, and we've forgotten the fact that it is a plant and it's going to react to what we do. And it's only when all of a sudden that plant doesn't do what you want it to do that all of a sudden you rear your head again and go, oh, I think I'm working with a plant-based system. And now I've got to figure out how to fix it. And one of the things I've found over the years, ecophysiology, one of the benefits of this system is it allows me to think about things on a continuous basis from a plant-based approach. But let's just first get some definition of what Silvics and ecophysiology are so everybody's clear on that. Silvics are essentially the principles underlying the growth and development of a stand and the trees. While ecophysiology is the physiological and morphological processes of plants in response to their environment. The two are tied together, yet they're separate. In my simple thinking, and my wife does say that is very true with me, is that from this, the way I look at it is Silvics gets me in the general ballpark, while ecophysiology gets me down on the playing surface. It lets me know exactly what's going on. Both of them are important. Both of them have a different focus. What I did is, when Keith asked me to talk about some Silvics, I said, okay, I went to a Silvics text and I came down and said, okay, these are all of the attributes. When I read a Silvics text, that they tell me about the species that you people have to address in some of your stands out here that are being hit by mountain pine beetle. And when I look at the Silvics information, what it does is it gives me some information about, okay, where does it fit in the ecological succession? Where does the species fit there? Where is it generally located? Is it tolerant to light or not? How does it handle temperatures? What do the normal temperatures have during the growing season? What are the extremes? What are the kind of soils it is exposed to? And those soils are things like, it not only tell you what kind of nutrients it's going to be exposed to, but what kind of water status it's going to be. Those are all ecophysiological processes, but done at a bigger scale. So why is ecophysiology important? What I found over the years, and I taught silviculture and I came out of a forest resource management background, is foresters know how to grow trees. And Silvics allow us to do that. The question is, do foresters know how trees grow? And it's interesting, I used to get into a whole bunch of lively debates. I don't know if any of you know Glenn Dunsworth. He was a very lively gentleman who worked for McMillan Modell and Weyerhaeuser for a number of years as a research forester. And Glenn and I used to have these lively discussions because he used to look at me and go, Steve, all ecophysiology does is tell me a better story. I don't need it to do my job. And in a lot of ways he's right. You don't need it to do all of your job. But what I found ecophysiology is important is all of a sudden when that program goes sideways. And I've been in enough programs to know they go sideways sooner or later, especially when you're dealing with a plant-based system. Or when you're in a situation where I've hit a roadblock and there is no new technology out here to do this process. And I now have to find a new way to do this. Ecophysiology, by essentially letting the plant talk back to you and say, this is how I respond to these systems, you can now develop techniques which allow those plants to move forward in the way you want to with the cultural practices you've now devised. So I don't have the ability within an hour to tell you all the things you need to do, especially related to silvicultural practices and ecophysiological responses. I'd be here for a long time and I'd put everybody into the table. So what I'm going to try to do here is give you a series of short stories over the next hour that really show you how plants respond to the systems out there that you're working in. And once you understand some of those responses, you'll be able to think about, okay, if I do these kind of practices, this is how these plants might respond. So I want you to get thinking like a tree, is really what I'm trying to do here. Like I said, when I started this talk, I knew very little about mountain pine beetle. For the last 14 years, I've been working for a forest biotechnology company trying to turn those little plantlets into trees. And so, we were dealing with stuff down in the southeast US, so the mountain pine beetle was written in the papers, but I knew enough, like I said, to be dangerous. And so I know these guys know more about it than I do. So what I did is I went and looked at the literature and said, okay, I can't develop an expertise that quickly, but what I want to do is I just need to look at it in relation to what I would do as an ecophysiologist. What are the important things I would want to do? And I was able to find a paper by Hawkins where they looked at like 459 sites. And they surveyed these sites to find out what was out there. And it was just very interesting for me to understand what is left out there. And the discussions this morning were perfect to set up some of this because it really pretty much says what I don't even have to go into in detail. And what they were finding is the same things that was talked about this morning. That these stands, there's material left on those sites. There's a structure to that site. That structure has a whole different series of layers. It has regeneration, sometimes at pretty high levels. But one of the things I found intriguing was this last point. It's variable. In comparison to a reforestation site, which I was used to and I spent a lot of time on, the humans put that reforestation site together, and we tend to do it in a very humanistic way. We kind of make it nice and even, we put the trees out in a certain way, and we do the site prep, we do all these things, and everything is pretty much the same process going on out there with some microsite differences. We've got a different regular structure, which is going to create all kinds of interesting conditions. One of the things I also saw was that we also have a whole lot of different species out there on that site. And depending on, seems like in the sites that I looked at when I did this survey, it's predominantly lodgepole pine or the spruce species. And it shifts whether you're looking at stands where they're hit when they're older stands or where they're younger stands. So what does this mean to somebody like myself, who knows nothing about this but is looking at it just as an ecophysiologist? You essentially have multiple environments with multiple tree species, which is going to create one heck of a lot of wide range of plant responses out there on that site. And as a result, one size isn't going to fit all. You're going to have to deal with that site, and Dave brought that up this morning, is you're going to have to go out and look at those sites. And even if you go out and look at that site like he recommended, you're going to be on that site, you could still have a range of conditions and situations. And you're going to have to accept that when you start putting your management practices in place and understand how plants respond to that. So let's look at this a little bit, and let's frame this a little bit more in that once we have the mountain pine beetle hits these sites, we're going to create a different structure than was there before. When I call it the ecological or environmental structure. Because initially, in an older stand, that sun's coming down, it's hitting the top of your canopy, and that's where a lot of your activity is. You have your transpiration going on there, as was brought up this morning by Chuck and some of the other people. You know, you have now a process that's up in the upper layers of that canopy. As soon as you start taking that canopy and breaking it down, that ecological structure changes, because what you've done is you've now taken that sun that used to be hitting the top, and now it's now moving through the canopy and hitting different areas. As a result, different things are starting to speed up. Things are changing. Environments in one area are going to be different from another. And when, you know, what this means to you is that under situations when there's minimal environmental stress, you're going to have few silvicultural issues. And this is where the Silvics come into play. It's like, okay, I can put this in, I can have this system, I can design it, it'll go forward, it'll pretty much work according to plan. However, if you now start getting into multiple stands and now you get these things exposed to stress, you're not going to have silvicultural issues. In other words, your silvicultural process that you put in play might not work the way you thought they were. Because stress occurs out there on that site, and stress comes in many forms and many combinations. Now, I was taught a long time ago, and it's come back time and again in all my working with different operational programs and looking at ecophysiology within those, is stress comes in some combination of duration, timing, and intensity. We all tend to think of it as that frost event that did it, or that cold event, or that drought that occurred. So when I give you some of these many stories I'm going through, you're going to see that it's not always the case. Sometimes that stress is they're all getting pecked to death by a flock of ducks. So it's a completely different type of response. And I think you need to be aware of that when you start getting into doing silvicultural practices in some of these stands. Just to review, one of the things you're going to see that happens on these sites as they open up, and this just gives you an idea of the kinds of things that can happen. You're going to have greater incoming solar radiation. You're going to have wider temperature swings. You're going to have a change in your evaporative demand in that site. Wind speeds are now going to come in there. You're going to have higher soil temperatures. On some sites, you're going to have too much moisture. On some sites, you're going to have too little moisture. And on top of that, as we talked about this morning, the whole nutrient process speeds up. All these are going to be going on out there, and we're going to be putting trees, or we're going to be dealing with the trees that are out there. This is what you're going to have to wrestle with. So let's just take some of these mini stories, or short stories I was going to talk to you about, and let's just talk about first the energy environment. We won't go into detail, but it just lets you know this is what happens. Sun comes in from either scattered, direct, all kinds of things happen, hits the plant. On top of that, we have thermal energy that's coming off of that. It's either absorbed into the soil, radiating out of the soil, coming across. All kinds of things are going on out there that are hitting that plant and causing it to react to light. And on top of that, what you're going to have as a situation is you have your canopy and it opens up. Like you said, there's data that shows that light comes into that system. Too much canopy there, the light is not there. On top of that, you're going to have dynamics through that system. If you have a deciduous cover, that's going to change. It's going to change that dynamic. So you're going to all of a sudden lose all that light at one time of the year the plant wants to grow, if you have an understory you want to deal with. And why is that important? Here's a classic photosynthetic light response curve for a conifer tree. What it shows, under very low light levels, you essentially have no photosynthesis occurring. The plant is actually respiring. As you get more light, you see a very dramatic increase in light up to about 40% of full sunlight. This is 40% of full sunlight. PAR is called photosynthetically active radiation. That's our net photosynthesis on that axis. And so somewhere around in here is where you're reaching a point where, yes, we're still having increases in photosynthesis, and the reasons for it, we won't get into that today, but the dramatic change has occurred. And why is that important? Well, here's an example of a study where these people planted both conifer, or both bare root and container seedlings. I only have the bare root seedling data on there. And they planted some trees, large stock, under competition and non-competition. these plants on average were only receiving, in the competitive, were only receiving light up to approximately 35% of full sunlight at the mid-canopy point in those trees. While the trees that didn't have any competition were able to pretty much photosynthesize and were exposed to all light levels. Over time, and this is 11 years for height growth and 8 years for diameter growth, those plants that didn't have the competition grew bigger in size. So, simple logic is, well, light's better, and open stands are better. Well, it depends. And here's some data actually from Vic that shows the same thing, where he was looking at transmission of light through a canopy onto spruce saplings, and what he found, height growth increased to approximately 40% of full sunlight. Thereafter, any more light did not affect height growth. However, another study showed that if we increase light and continually increase light, diameter growth, in other words, the biomass of that tree continues to increase. So what we can say, very simply, when we look at one variable on its own, solar radiation, low light levels, and increasing light is very critical for that plant response. And up to about 40% of full sunlight, you're going to get continued height growth. You're going to continue to get diameter growth if you continue to add more light into that system. And if this is our main concern, silviculture treatments need to be concerned about that, to look at the ways to reduce that light or reduce that competition so those plants have access to more light. However, there's a flip side to this. We open up the site, we have other issues that occur. And here's an example of what happens when plants are exposed to open areas and frost occur in those situations. In this study, they were looking at the sky view factor, and as essentially you open up that site, those plants, they found that plants had a better chance of being exposed to and having frost damage. And if we look at two different sites, completely open site versus a closed forest canopy, you can see that across the season, that open site has the potential to be exposed in the boreal forest to more frost events. So why is that important? We all know that boreal species are very tolerant to frost. They can be down to -70, -60. This is some data that I found in the literature of their exposure to frost in the middle of winter. In fact, we actually did a study once on some interior spruce from a northern area, and we were using a freezing bath that went down to -80, and we didn't hit bottom. We still hadn't found out where these plants were damaged in the dead of winter. However, in the summertime, it's different. And here is a classic curve of how a boreal spruce changes its frost tolerance throughout the year. And we measured two different variables here, one called LT50 and one called CT. LT50 is essentially lethal temperature or death. CT is a critical temperature, and it's a very interesting variable. It's something, I mean, we all can see death. You know, we always seen frost event, and we can see the frost burn on the plant. Well, when you hit a critical temperature and that plant's exposed to it, you cannot see that damage. You and I, our visual eye, can't see that. When I take measurements with different types of equipment, I can see that those cells are damaged. Well, what does that mean? It's very interesting. There was a study done where they exposed some spruce plants to one frost event in the middle of the summertime. 4 degree, I think it was a 4 or 5, -4 or -5 degree frost event. And photosynthesis of older and new needles dropped immediately the next day. And it's still 11 days out, still hadn't recovered to where it was. One frost event. I saw this and I thought, this is kind of neat. What happens to growth if you turn around and do this? So what we did is we took a bunch of trees, tried the exact same thing, gave them a -5 degree frost, grew them on that year, hardened them up, and then grew them the next year. This is what happens the second year after a frost event. You can't see that damage, but that plant is responding to that frost event a year later with reduced shoot growth. And I thought, okay, that's because it's related to the bud, and somehow we damaged the bud when it was doing. It also caused a reduction in root growth. So you're standing out on that reforestation site and you're looking at that tree and going, why isn't that thing growing? I haven't had anything happen this year. This event happened a year ago. It had that kind of carryover effect. You have to recognize the fact that frost events occur throughout the season. And as we open up that stand, there's a potential for those events to occur. During the growing season, they have very low tolerance to drought or frost. And it can have implications on its physiological response and subsequent long-term morphological development. So let's look at something else that's related to the energy cycle. The hydrologic cycle is kind of tied up next to that. They're both tied together, and what I'm just showing you here once again is that, when water comes into the system, water moves through the system, water moves out of the system through transpiration, through seepage, through evaporation. Lots going on out there. The plants are responding to that. And I think what you need to know is the plants are responding to this literally second by second out there. It's happening all the time. And what they're really responding to is called atmospheric vapor pressure deficit. It's very surprising that plants do not respond to humidity per se, relative humidity. If you correlate performance response, gas exchange responses to relative humidity, you get a shotgun pattern. Plants don't even, doesn't make any sense to them. But they respond, there's a direct correlation between the vapor pressure deficit and how a plant responds in the field. And what is vapor pressure deficit? Is it a relationship between temperature shifts and relative humidity? Simply put, vapor pressure deficit is a drying power of air. And plants respond to that. And you can look at it, it's very interesting if you think about it. At 10 degrees C, I can have the exact same vapor deficit if I have 10 degrees C and 20% relative humidity as I have at 35 degrees C and 80% relative humidity. I've actually grown plants and kept them from being droughted by keeping the humidity low and the temperature down and keeping disease away. And we use that as a tool when we were growing tissue culture plantlets. It was a heck of a way to keep disease away and allow these plants to get established and keep their feet from getting wet. And all we were doing is letting the plant dictate how they were responding to that environment and how they were drying out. It's a very powerful tool. Plants respond to it all the time.